Did you know that sometimes, when you think you're making the right decision, you're actually destroying everything you wanted most? This is the story of a woman who dumped the love of her life because of his weight, and 2 years later, she had to live with the regret of never being able to go back. I know this may sound like any other story, but believe me, it's not. What happened to this woman isn't something you see every day, but it's something anyone can learn from. She was completely happy with her boyfriend, but an impulsive decision caused her to lose everything she loved most. And what's worse, she only realized it too late. Today, I'm going to tell you how a simple mistake can change your life forever. But before I start this exciting story, tell me here in the comments where you're watching from today, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Let's get started. Everything seemed perfect at first. Leticia and Pedro were in love. They lived a routine of simple joys together, and they were inseparable. They had known each other since they were teenagers, always supporting each other, sharing dreams and creating memories. But over time, something began to change in a silent, almost imperceptible way. Leticia began to be bothered by Pedro's weight. At first, she didn't notice, but with the jokes from friends, the strange looks at parties, and the increasingly heavy social pressure on beauty standards, she began to feel uncomfortable. She was an attractive woman, with a body that had always been admired, and next to Pedro, she felt that the contrast didn't make sense. She saw couples where the two of them were physically similar, with sculpted bodies and smiles, and she began to wonder if their relationship shouldn't also follow this pattern. Something inside her told her that Pedro needed to change, not just for his sake, but also for hers. It wasn't just about the stares, but about the feeling that he wasn't trying hard enough to keep up with her. Although Pedro had tried a few times to join the gym and go on diets, he didn't seem committed enough. The promises of change never materialized, and every day Leticia felt as if she was carrying the weight of the relationship alone. She wondered if he was really trying, or if he was just expecting her to be the one to carry the responsibility, the one to want more, while he remained in his comfort zone. Little by little, she noticed that Peter's dissatisfaction with her appearance was no longer a superficial concern, but an emotional blockage that was eating away at the relationship. Conversations became more tense. She couldn't hide the resentment growing inside her. He, on the other hand, felt that, despite his efforts, she no longer saw him as she used to. She didn't see him with the same affection. It was as if the love he offered wasn't enough. Every gesture of affection, every attempt to please, seemed to become invisible to her. Pedro began to realize that what she wanted was not just a thinner man, but a version of herself that met her expectations. The tension grew, and as a result, Leticia began to feel pressured. She wanted to be happy. She wanted to be with someone who was in tune with her values, who shared her vision of the future. The idea of a partner who was also physically fit, successful, and in her mind, ideal, began to grow more and more. But what Leticia didn't see was that she was starting to put a label on love. She was letting herself be carried away by the superficiality of what society imposed, and Pedro's beauty, with all his heart and charming personality, no longer seemed enough. Until one day, after yet another argument about his appearance, Leticia did something she had never imagined. She broke up with him. Without taking a step back, without trying to understand what was really going on inside her. She believed she was doing the right thing, but she didn't know that, at that moment, she was making a decision that would change her life forever. Their relationship, with all its ups and downs, was coming to an end. After the breakup, Leticia thought she was finally free to move on, to look for what she believed was ideal for her life. She felt relieved at first, as if she had made a decision that would free her from the bonds of a relationship that no longer made sense to her. The idea of being alone seemed to be the best solution to rediscover herself, to seek something more in line with her values, her own standards of happiness. But soon, things didn't turn out as she had imagined. The emptiness began to take hold of her in unexpected ways. She tried to get involved with other men, but the feeling that she was searching for something that didn't make sense was evident. No relationship seemed to fill the space Peter had left. She couldn't stop thinking about how he loved her unconditionally, even in her imperfections. She thought about how he was always willing to support her dreams, her aspirations, even when the relationship was full of doubts. Letitia tried to convince herself that Pedro was no longer the right person for her. She had distanced herself emotionally, but the feeling of loss constantly haunted her. She began to realize too late that what she most wanted back was not the perfect body, but the man who made her feel special in a way that no one else could. She tried to occupy her mind with the idea that she had made the best decision, but Pedro's presence in her memory was inescapable. It was impossible not to compare every gesture, every word, and even the hugs, with the emptiness she now felt in the relationships she was trying to establish. With each new encounter, Letitia felt further away from what she was really looking for. She realized that by distancing herself from Pedro, she had distanced herself from something deeper that she hadn't realized before. True love isn't built on appearances or social standards. Meanwhile, Peter was going through his own transformation. Initially devastated by the breakup, he felt lost, not knowing how to deal with the pain of rejection. But over time, he began to make decisions that would later be responsible for a profound change in his life. Pedro began to consciously invest in his health, no longer to please Letitia, but to take care of himself and find an emotional balance. He sought professional help, started training regularly, and changed his eating habits. His transformation was not only physical, but also internal. He learned to deal with pain in a more mature way, to focus on himself and his evolution, without worrying about others' approval. Each day of effort brought Pedro a sense of control over his life that he had never experienced before. Over time, Pedro was no longer the man Letitia had known, the one who felt inferior. He was someone renewed, stronger, and more confident, someone who had learned to value himself fully. But the big turning point wasn't the change in Peter. It was the moment when Letitia, after 2 years, began to ask herself, "Have I made the biggest mistake of my life?" Regret began to grow inside Letitia like a shadow, something she couldn't ignore. She found herself, at unexpected moments, thinking of Pedro, remembering the days when he made her laugh, when they faced life's ups and downs together. Those memories began to emerge more intensely, like a persistent echo in her mind. She thought about how much he had always been there for her, the simple gestures full of affection, like when he hugged her without saying anything, just to let her know that everything would be all right. But Letitia still tried to resist the thought that popped into her mind. Has he changed? She wanted to believe that she had made the right decision, but the emptiness she felt without him was unbearable. Letitia tried to move on, but something didn't fit. Her relationships with other men, while enjoyable, didn't have the depth she felt with Pedro. None of them had that special touch that she always thought only she could give Pedro. The despair and pain of losing Pedro overwhelmed her to such an extent that, in a moment of reflection, Letitia wondered if her view of what was important in life had been distorted by external pressure. She began to realize that true love wasn't about aesthetic standards or the search for perfection. She realized that by abandoning Peter for an appearance that didn't match her expectations, she had lost someone who loved her genuinely, without expecting anything in return. She remembered the moments when he looked at her with that sincere smile, and how he cared for her unconditionally. That was when she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had made an irreparable mistake. Letitia, who until then had convinced herself that she was better off without him, began to wonder if Pedro, with all his efforts to improve, would ever become the person she could love again. But now things were different. Pedro was no longer the same man. He had become someone more confident, more centered, someone who seemed to have found his own path. Letitia felt a mixture of pride and longing for him, but at the same time, a deep and poignant pain. She had known that Pedro, over time, had become the man she had always wanted him to be, but he no longer needed her. He had found himself, and, although she still wanted to be by his side, she knew that he no longer needed her in the same way. The reality that perhaps Peter had moved on and didn't feel the same way about her was the hardest blow. She wanted to call him, she wanted him to know how sorry she was, but she knew that time wouldn't turn back the clock. What she didn't know was that Pedro, on his new path, was also thinking about her. The connection between the two of them had been strong, But now, she would have to face the possibility that the distance he had created for himself was not something she could break so easily. She was about to discover that life has a habit of giving second chances, but rarely in the way we expect. Time passed, and life took its course for both of them. Leticia found herself adrift, trying to fill the void left by Pedro's departure, but to no avail. She finally understood what Pedro had always known, that true love is not about appearance, nor about the incessant search for an ideal that society imposes. It was about mutual support, about growing together, and above all, about being loved for your faults and qualities, without the need for external changes in order to be accepted. But the pain Leticia was carrying wasn't just regret over the rash decision to end the relationship. She regretted more that she hadn't seen what was right in front of her eyes, Pedro's unconditional love. Now the doubt that consumed her was, would I still have a chance with him? She had learned that Peter, even though he had undergone an impressive transformation, did not depend on her to continue his journey. He had become someone who was self-sufficient, someone who understood that, in order to be happy, he first needed to take care of himself. Pedro was no longer seeking approval from anyone, especially Leticia. He knew how to find peace in his own company, and this made him able to see the world and others more clearly. Leticia knew that any attempt to rekindle the relationship had to be sincere, without empty promises or illusions that they could relive the past. The reality was harsh, but the truth was the only thing that held firm throughout. Pedro was no longer the man she had known, and she wasn't the same woman either. They had evolved, but in different ways. However, even with the distance, there was something profoundly transformative about it all. Leticia understood that, as much as life offers us opportunities to start again, not all of them align with our desires. Sometimes the greatest lesson is to learn to live with what we have, instead of trying to control what we can't change. True love is not measured by second chances, but by the ability to grow, evolve, and eventually understand that the most important thing is to be at peace with the choices we make. Leticia knew at last that Pedro had already found his path, and she now needed to find hers. Would you like to see more exciting stories like this? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future videos. And for those of you who like a good story and watched to the end, leave your comment. I stayed until the end. Remember, the most valuable lessons come from the most difficult moments. See you in the next video.